Oh, sorry, just wanted to click that. So we'll look at some state testing laws, and if you're thinking about implementing a testing law for your company, we'll talk about some of the common themes that we see among states and among at the federal level with the Department of Transportation with their CDL drivers as well. As with most months, this is my name's Kevin Mosher, and I'm a certified labor and employment law specialist up here in our Minneapolis or Minnesota office for Thompson Co. Cousins and Irons, and part of the labor and employment group at Thompson Co. And for those of you who need like CLEs and HRCI and SHRM credits, those things will be, the certifications for those will be sent out to you after the webinar. So if you have any questions, we don't, this is kind of a one-way type of deal, but you are welcome to type in some questions into the, there's probably some sort of like question box or something like that on the right side of your screen that you're able to type into, and periodically, I think I'll have some time today to take a look at those questions and hopefully address them. And some people had sent me a couple questions in advance of the webinar today, so hopefully I will get to those. I'm going to try to remember to get to those during the course of the webinar as well. In full disclosure, it's not marijuana, but I did take some Claritin, so I don't know if allergies are occurring or some sort of respiratory thing. So rather than coughing through most of this webinar, I did decide to take some Claritin. So, full disclosure on that I am, while I am certainly not on marijuana or cannabis, I did take some medication right now. So anyway, today is National Weed Day. Congratulations. I had no idea until somebody in the office who was trying to, talking to me about dates and that sort of thing, decided, hey, how apropos that it is National Weed Day and we're going to have a drug testing medical marijuana webinar. And I'm glad they knew, because I didn't. More of a like National Big Lebowski Day. But that's what today is. So congratulations for those of you on this call who are celebrating. And I hope you enjoy the celebration. And then tomorrow is National Drug Testing Day, and then I guess it's Saturday, but call it Monday, is National Unemployment Day. And I think those are absolutely, out of all these like national made-up days, I think that is absolutely hilarious. And I had no idea, but it's fantastic. So whoever came up with National Weed Day followed by National Drug Testing Day followed by National Unemployment Day is pretty genius on that, and I really think it's smart. So, but that's what we're doing here today. So today we're going to talk about medical marijuana, medical cannabis. We're going to talk about the states, and we're going to look at a map and see the states that legalize this thing, and the difference between medical marijuana, medical cannabis, and recreational. So we'll talk about the differences between medical versus recreational, and then we'll talk about just general ideas and concepts for drug testing. I mean, one of the issues here is that there is no federal drug testing law, right? I mean, you've got the Department of Transportation, but that's specific to CDLs and airline pilots and stuff like that. So you've got that, you've got the Department of Transportation rules, but you don't have some sort of national law that governs how employers should test. So it comes down to the states. And when it comes down to the states, you never know what you're going to get. But so it's good for us to kind of look at some of the common themes among those states, and there are only a handful of states that have very robust drug testing laws. And if your state doesn't have, like if you're in Texas, for example, there is no Texas drug testing law, so it's kind of wild, wild west there. And Illinois is the same, and a lot of states are the same. Colorado as well. You can kind of do whatever you want with drug testing. It's strange in Colorado because of the recreational marijuana availability in Colorado, but you can kind of do whatever you want drug testing to a point. And so we'll talk about some themes there and how, if you're thinking about doing some sort of drug testing, or you're looking at your policy and looking to create a policy, just some themes that might guide you along the way. And we'll look at a few states, Minnesota, Iowa, and California. We're going to look at those states. For my money, Minnesota, I'm biased up here, but Minnesota has a really well-balanced and comprehensive law on drug testing. Iowa's is actually a little bit more comprehensive, but it's more employee-sided than the Minnesota law. And so I often recommend to people that if they're looking to create a drug testing policy or a framework of sorts, that they look at the Minnesota law, because it's and try to craft off that, because it's a very balanced policy. It's obviously, it's going to be more employee friendly than if you were in Illinois or Texas, because you get a free test before you get fired. But it's, overall it's pretty comprehensive and has a lot of stuff in it that's worth looking at. So, okay. And by the way, there is a National Big Lebowski Day, and I guess it's, probably not too dissimilar from National Weed Day. Okay, so medical marijuana or medical cannabis on this, here are the states that have it, that have these sorts of laws. And this is, there's been a lot of push in the last several years to expand medical marijuana to a lot of states. And the reason is, well, you've got a couple camps. You've got one camp of parents of, sick children that have chronic diseases and a lot of pain, and those parents are pushing for medical cannabis so that their kids, so that it can relieve the symptoms on their children. And I think a lot of people get that, and that's what's getting a lot of legislation passed around the country. These, on the medical marijuana side, these moms and dads going to the legislatures and showing how much pain their children are in, and how they really would like some sort of solution like medical cannabis, and for their chronic pain. And so a lot of states like Minnesota adopted medical marijuana, medical cannabis laws as a result. But then you've got obviously the we like to smoke weed crowd and the more recreational crowd, and so they push the medical marijuana, medical cannabis as well, because they think of it as a slippery slope. So hey, they go medical, then the next thing they're going to do is go recreational. And so there's a lot of concern in these states like Minnesota and North Dakota and that sort of thing, that it's just going to be a slippery slope, and that the medical side is going to get pushed aside for the recreational, and before you know it, Minnesota is going to become like Nevada or Colorado or California, where people are smoking up a lot, and those states are down. So they're looking for the people for recreational use are looking more for the high. And by the way, if you could always tell when it's weed week, I guess, now that I'm actually paying attention to it, and know that that the 420 is National Weed Day. My news feed has had tons and tons of marijuana news articles, whether it's at the federal level or state level. I even saw an article about earlier this week. I even saw an article about helicopter type mom who's an attorney, I guess, going to college, where her 19-year-old son was there and smoking up weed and with him. And so I guess like the stigma is not as much for the millennials, and so things are just overall changing. I mean, years ago we would not have been having this conversation about medical marijuana and recreational use in all these states. So this is a very new concept. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Bill Clinton wouldn't even admit to inhaling. I guess it's over 20 years ago, but still, it's not that long ago. And now that's not even a thing. who would really care? So the world is changing, I guess, and even this year we're going to see likely new laws on the books that are expanding the use of medical marijuana and medical cannabis. And so, it would not surprise me that 10, 15 years from now, most states have some sort of recreational marijuana use. And so here's this chart showing a few of the states that are likely. So New Jersey and Virginia being a couple of the important ones that are looking to legalize this year. And then the green ones are recreational use as well as medical use. So that's still, there just aren't that many. But then we've got the medical use only, and the medical use makes, again, for chronic pain and everything, I guess it can make a lot of sense. And I know there's been a lot of research into this, but what's interesting about this map is so often when I give webinars, this is one of the things that struck me about this map. Most months when I give a webinar, and we talk about state laws, whether it's ban the box or some transgender rights or sexual orientation, discrimination, that sort of thing, for example, and we just see a complete north-south, east-west divide, right? So pockets in the Midwest, and then the West Coast, and then the East Coast, New England, they're going to be more on the progressive side of employee rights laws, and so the maps often look very, very much like our political maps, where you've got the West, very progressive, like recognizing sexual orientation, and Minnesota and several other states in the Midwest, and then you've got the East Coast, like New England, recognizing. So what struck me about this map is it doesn't seem to break down as much on political lines, and so just seeing Arkansas and Louisiana and Florida in Arizona do the medical, have laws on the books for medical use right now, and Kentucky coming on board as well. So it struck me that the marijuana issue might not be like so many of these other employment law issues. It might not be as politically divisive and as politically oriented. And it's similar with drug testing laws. I mean, you don't have a drug. When is Texas and Illinois ever on the same page? And kind of California to an extent. I mean, all three of those states don't have laws on the books governing drug testing in the workplace. I mean, so California and Texas couldn't be further, more distinct in the way that they approach employee laws, right? But neither of them has a law exactly on the books for private employers that tell you how to do drug testing. So it's just interesting. The drug testing seems to not be as politically divisive, which I found interesting. Okay, here's some facts about medical versus recreational use on marijuana, and if this is interesting to you, that's great. I'm glad it's in here. I am not an expert in cannabis or THC, so but I do know that the cannabis, I believe that's not. I mean, so in Minnesota, it's not. In some states, the medical marijuana is smoked, but in Minnesota, it's not. It for example, it comes in like a pill. So a little. That's my understanding, like a little cannabis pill. So the this is the THC gives the euphoric the euphoric effect, but then the cannabis gets it has other impacts. And sorry, I'm not really great at this, except that I know that there's, on the medical side, there's more of a push for medical cannabis in a non-smoking form, which is like what Minnesota does and some of the other medical states, versus a smoking form, which I believe California does on their medical side. Here are the positive effects of medical marijuana. May help with appetite loss and may help relieve nausea and vomiting. And again, a lot of the reason that these states are passing laws on the medical side is, first of all, there is some increasing research. Also, when one or two or three states, and now a lot of states, jump on the bandwagon and will pass a law, it's very common for other states to say, oh, okay, I guess cat's out of the bag. I mean, we can go and do it. We can go and do it as well. And so that's why I think you've seen a lot of Me Too laws coming out of here. But the other thing is the activists have figured out how to sell it. And like I say, here in Minnesota, we had, moms and dads with their very sick with chronic disease children, showing up at the Capitol and showing up in the rotunda and all the time, and showing how much pain their children were in. I mean, it's a very heartfelt symbol, and it's a really great advocacy tool to get this. And so, it's hard to say, well, we don't want to do something that in like a pill medical cannabis form that could potentially relieve your child who's in a lot of pain. So they figured out, not only does it just take one or two states to kind of do this, but the advocates have also just figured out how to sell it better. And so I think, this is going to become an increasing trend, especially on the medical side. Recreational side, I don't know. I think it's going to take like 10, 15 years. Not to mention there's just so much money. I didn't include a slide on it, on the issue, but there's so much money being made. I mean, it's like marijuana vacations and stuff, or whatever they call them, to California. I mean, people are taking their or Colorado, people are taking their trips to these places to specifically get marijuana in all of its various forms. And so, that's great for the tourist industry. I'm sure there are a lot of statistics out there as to what the impact on the state and local economies from these, in these states that allow for recreational use. And if there's a lot of money at stake, then I suspect other states will jump in trying to seek a revenue stream. Recreational use may be self-medicating due to prohibition. Anyway, so I think we all kind of get what recreational use of marijuana is. Okay, there you go. Back. That's the background on medical marijuana. So let's talk about drug testing. So, like I said, there is no federal law on drug testing per se. So we need to look at the state. So your state where your employees are in, it's going to be the state. If you have employees in multiple states, then we need to understand which where they work. And so if they work in a state that has a drug testing law, then you're going to need to comply with that state rule, right? If you're in a state like Texas or Illinois or many others that doesn't have a drug testing law, then you can kind of make it up on your own. Now, I would recommend that you follow some sort of structure, and so we're going to talk about a structure to follow. But let's go through this. So anyway, why drug test? So tomorrow is National Surprise Drug Test Day. And for those of you, that have policies that allow you to do random testing. Now, random testing tends to be for safety sensitive jobs, but again, it doesn't have to be if you're in a state that doesn't have a drug testing law. But so why would we want to drug test? Well, first of all, there's a safety issue. Even if you're in a state with recreational use, I mean, just because you're in a state like Colorado, for example, that it's not illegal. Well, neither is alcohol. I mean, alcohol is not illegal. It hasn't been illegal since Prohibition ended. But that doesn't mean that an employer has to tolerate somebody coming in drunk, right? So it just makes sense that an employer is still able to govern what happens within their workplace. And I talk about this all the time, but employers have a few duties, right, toward their employees. And one of probably the biggest one, at least off the top of my head, the biggest one is the requirement, the duty that they provide a safe working environment. I mean, OSHA requires this, but nobody wants to be sued for liability as well, right? So I mean, we, as a general rule, we want to maintain a safe working environment. So with a safe working environment, a drug test can be part of that. It can be part and parcel of it. So especially if there's driving going on, but forget the driving aspect of it. It just might be safer in the workplace if everybody's not high. if everybody's not drunk. And so that might be a reason, like even in California or even in Colorado, where people are smoking weed recreationally, it still might make sense to test them for drugs because it impacts the workplace. So even if it's legal outside the context of work, it doesn't mean that when the person reports to work that you can't mandate that they be cognizant and clean, not drunk, not high. And the alcohol thing makes sense because obviously we've been dealing with that for decades and decades. But now that marijuana is legal, we have to. It's like we have to think about this as well. But it's really kind of the same thing. Now there are some states that have laws. A lot of states that have laws on the books that say that as an employer you cannot prohibit employees from engaging in lawful practices, right? So you can't discipline or fire an employee for drinking beer outside work. A bunch of states will have this sort of law. However, once the employee comes to work, even if they legally consumed alcohol, that does not mean that you can't restrict them once they come to work. So it's not that you're disciplining or firing them for legally consuming alcohol or even legally consuming marijuana, but you would be disciplining them for what happens when they come to work. They come to work inebriated. And that's then the problem. And that's legal. And that's going to be legal. So in all these states, so even if you're in Colorado, and after the medical marijuana, after recreational use for marijuana in Colorado was legal, there was a case on this exact thing, and the employee, the applicant, who was an applicant at the time, said, well, no, I smoked weed, but then they did a pre-employment drug test, and the guy was positive. He's like, yeah, I was positive, but it's legal. Well, he lost, right? I mean, that's that you're gonna lose that. Alcohol is legal too. It doesn't mean you should show up drunk when you're taking the test. So in these states where there's recreational use, it still might behoove us to do drug tests. Drug tests, especially, there's a safety component to it. Reduce accidents, reduce people tripping over themselves, hitting one another. I don't know. You can imagine it. That potentially reduces your risk of liability in the workplace, insurance costs, that sort of thing. Not to mention public image. What's your culture? What's the culture of your company? Is the culture of your company, are you trying to recruit? I mean, because if you're trying to recruit from a certain population, like millennials or something like that, well, you might have a hard time implementing drug tests. So, you have to identify what the culture of your company is, what you're trying to achieve through the expansion of your employees and the growth of your business. And if drug testing is going to be a problem because you're not going to be able to recruit very well if you're doing pre-employment testing, then you might not want to do it. Other reasons are listed here. Questions to ask yourself on why, if you're asking yourself, like, why do you drug test? What are you trying to achieve? Voluntary? Are you going to do voluntary or involuntary drug testing? Who are you trying to recruit? Targeting? So these are the initial questions that we want to ask. What are your competitors doing? What are other businesses in the area doing? Are you going to be standing out by doing drug testing or by not doing drug testing? Is there a potential impact on your insurance rates? Is this going to affect your public image? These are all questions that you want to ask yourself before implementing a drug test. Now, in some situations, like with DOT drivers, you don't have a choice. But for most employers out there that don't have CDLs, driving commercial motor vehicles, most employers have the choice whether they want to drug test or not. And so if they are, these are the questions to ask as part of the conversation. Some states will say what you can, what the events are. They'll dictate what the events are that will trigger the drug test. And so so in Minnesota, for example, these are the exact these are the exact circumstances. They are in line with the Department of Transportation's rules on drug testing as well, and a lot of other states will have will have the their framework along these lines. So pre-employment testing or promotion testing, normally you're doing it post. Almost always you're doing it post offer. Some states might require that you do it post offer, like Minnesota requires that you do it post offer of employment. But if you're doing, the drug test is a condition of employment. Probably best to tell the employee at the time, or the applicant at the time of the application, or at least at the time of the interview, that, hey, if we do select you, there are a couple conditions. We've got the I-9, obviously, you have to verify work authority, but then also there's going to be a drug test. If you have some sort of other testing, that's fine too, but there's going to be a pre-employment drug test. You might also use that pre-employment as promotion testing. So if you go from one job to another, you could do, your policy might allow for testing at that time. And the other thing I should say is, whatever you do, if you are going to have a drug testing policy, it needs to be in writing. And it has to be distributed, like as part of your handbook or separate, whatever, however you want to distribute it, doesn't matter to me, but it needs to be distributed, and it should be written, and it should be comprehensive. Most of the states that have drug testing laws that cover employers, like Minnesota and Iowa and a bunch of others, I think Louisiana as well, require written drug test policies that are distributed to employees. I mean, in Minnesota, you cannot, and Iowa, you cannot drug test anybody unless you have a written policy that's been communicated to the employees. I mean, it's straight up violation of the law if you drug test without a written policy. So your written policy you'll want to dictate all of these. And so if you're in a state like Illinois or Texas or a bunch of the other states that doesn't have a drug testing law, you will want to, as part of your drug testing policy, you are going to want to identify the circumstances upon which a drug test is triggered. And these are the most common ones, and you might not like rehab testing, you might not like routine physical testing, that's one that's not as commonly done, but you like reasonable suspicion, you like random, you like pre-employment, so you can kind of pick and choose. If you want to put in your policy all of them, that's great. Some states will say, for example, post-accident testing, like Iowa, I believe, says that you need to have at least a damage of $1,000 to a property damage of $1,000 before it triggers post-accident testing. Some states say $1,500. Some states might say something different. So you'll definitely want to know what your state says when you're doing post-accident testing. But if you're in Texas, you're in Illinois, who cares? You can do whatever you want. Now, your policy, you might want to say, post-accident testing, we don't want to test everybody. If it's just something really, really minor, then we're just going to if it's less than $1,000, then we're not going to do the testing, because it's not like drug tests are free or anything. Random testing tends to be for safety-sensitive jobs. Now, if you're in a state that doesn't have, if your employees are in a state that doesn't have a law, then you can do it, on everybody. Do it on the C-suite if you want. But for most states that have rules on this, you're talking about safety-sensitive jobs with the random testing, and so, that's we just kind of do. That's more common, I guess, is what I would say. So, but if you're creating a policy and you're not in one of those states that requires it, then you can kind of pick and choose. Like, do you want to do random testing for just people working with heavy machinery, or all safety sensitive people, or people who are given company vehicles? I mean, you can kind of define this. Obviously, we don't want to be discriminatory, but you can define how and who you want, by position or by type of job. Who we're going to do random testing. Routine physical, if you're doing annual physicals, you could do drug testing. That's the one I see the least. Reasonable suspicion, some states with drug testing laws will define this, but as a general rule, we look at the Department of Transportation stuff on this, and reasonable suspicion tends to you know, we would, if you're writing a policy, you probably would want to include some sort of example criteria, bullet point of what reasonable suspicion is. Change in behavior. Reasonable suspicion could even kind of include post-accident testing on minor accidents. It could be, you know, who knows, a fist fight or something like that. But there are a couple, you know, you could define what reasonable suspicion is. A lot of the states that have drug testing laws, a lot of those, they will say that only supervisors who have received specific training could you know, use this reasonable suspicion basis for triggering a drug test. And again, in Texas and other states, not a big deal. You know, so many states don't have drug testing laws, and you can define what reasonable suspicion is and when it's effective and when it's not effective, that sort of thing. So, but reasonable suspicion, oftentimes we want to have some sort of training in a perfect world, whether it's informal training or formal, you know, somebody coming in and training on all the, you know, drug testing knowledge and everything, like an outside consultant, or if it's more informal, just having HR do it. But supervisors who are called in to notify HR or whomever, safety officer, about drug testing, they should have some sort of training before they're called upon to issue reasonable suspicion testing. Again, triggering the drug test, that person's eyes are crazy, which is why they were included. So this person probably enjoying National Weed Day today, I guess. So pre-employment promotion testing, all employees for a certain job, promotions into tested jobs. So you could define, in a state that doesn't have a specific drug testing law, you would have the ability to define exactly what pre-employment or promotion testing is. So is it going to be for all new employees? Is it just going to be for certain job categories, certain promotions? I mean, if it's a person being promoted at a fairly low-level job, do you really care? Versus a person who's being promoted into management, or, you know, from one management job to another, you know, you might decide that those people you want to test, but then not others, right? Because again, it's not free, and but again, do we want to test it all? And that's why we get back to all those questions earlier. You know, is it our culture? Is it the type of thing we're going for? Is it going to hurt or help recruiting and morale? These are all valid questions to ask. I mean, you'd hate to lose a really good employee because they, you know, especially somebody who you're promoting to like management because they tested positive. Now, to me, and you always see this with, like, not to bash on football, but you know, the draft is coming up, so I'm thinking about football a little bit, but they all know when the drug test is coming, and a lot of them try to avoid the drug test, and they take all these crazy drug testing things. And there was the one guy here in Minnesota that was caught with it was like the Whiznator 5000 or something at the airport, because he was trying to use that to avoid the drug test. But really, in a lot of ways, drug testing is really just stupid testing. And you know, not to be a jerk about it, but if you know that there's going to be a drug test, and you know, because you're applying for a job or you're getting promoted and you've got a copy of the policy and everything, I mean, don't be stupid. And so a lot of times the reason you might want to test is because you just kind of want to weed out dumb people. And I always feel like that's kind of how it is with football players. They all know. They all know when the drug testing is coming. It's not a secret. It's going to come at the combine. It's going to come, you know, when they're at practice and stuff like that. There's no secret. So if you're stupid enough to have taken drugs or whatever, done whatever that's going to get you tested positive, that's important for employers to know, because just like it's important for football teams to know, because if the person's this dumb and can't even avoid testing, then are they really going to be a good employee? Are they going to be a long-term employee? Are they going to be this stupid in their job? So to me, one of the reasons you drug test is to weed out dumb people. If that's important for your organization. Maybe you want a bunch of dumb people. I don't know, but probably not. Probably something you're not going for. But it even, football players is the same. They, are you seriously this stupid that you knew the combine was coming up and you still tested positive? And every year there are people that do it, and so it's a good way to weed out people. Random. Use a neutral selection method like a third party, or you can do something internally. You could create some sort of internal random policy. What a lot of companies will do is they'll just do employee numbers, and they'll just randomly generate them. And again, normally it's safety sensitive jobs, and in Minnesota it has to be limited to safety sensitive jobs, as well as in some other states that have drug testing laws. And then there are no you don't want to give an exception. So if it's really important that you don't give exceptions if you're doing random testing, because then it can be seen as favoritism. Okay, I guess we've moved on to coke, I guess, from marijuana. So we've got post-accident testing, and then rehab testing, and then routine physical testing, and then reasonable suspicion testing. And again, post-accident testing, if you're in a state that doesn't have specific state guidance on this, you could determine what a quote accident is, and your policy should define what that accident is. So is an accident property damage of more than $1,000, or is it more than $500, or is it just any accident whatsoever? So there's a lot of flexibility in that. And like I said, in Iowa, I believe it has to be $1,000. Minnesota, I believe there's no definition of it, so you can kind of choose like what an accident is in Minnesota. Rehab testing. And again, just be consistent with whatever you choose, and I would outline it in the policy. So a lot of these things we want to outline in our policies, whatever it is. And then rehab testing, that's when the employee has tested positive previously, or if they've voluntarily gone into rehab, and then you could do testing of them while they're in rehab or after rehab. So for example, in Minnesota, you get a free pass on your first positive test, as long as you go into rehab, as long as you follow and go in and complete a rehabilitation protocol, and then you can be tested for 2 years, up to 2 years after rehab. So this is all part of rehab testing. Iowa has something very, very similar, and again, if you're in Illinois or Texas or California, you've got a lot of opportunity to create whatever you want as far as rehab testing or post-rehab testing goes. But if you want to look at what like Minnesota does a 24 months after the completion of rehab, where the person could be just randomly tested for drugs or alcohol. And so and if they do test positive, then they're out. I mean, you could fire them if you wanted to. They only get the one free shot. And then there's routine physical testing, which just isn't as common, just not as common that companies do routine physicals, except maybe for executives who are, or people who are key employees that might be receiving insurance or some specific individual insurance because they're important to the organization. Then reasonable suspicion testing, we talked about, it's supervisor spotting something, and then based on the actions of the employee. And so the key here is that we don't want employees who are trying to get at one another. So we want to do it based on something that we actually see, not that we hear about. So again, common themes. Policy must be in writing. And again, even if you're in a state that doesn't have a specific state law on this, if you're going to do drug testing, you really should have a policy and have it in writing. Now, if you don't have a drug testing policy and somebody goes and crashes a car, and you just want to find out if they were on alcohol or inebriated or something, well, if you're in one of those states where there's no drug testing law, then you could go in and test. But ideally, in a perfect world, when we're creating policy and limitations and all that sort of thing around how we govern our employees, we would ideally have a policy, and that policy would be in writing. And then the policy should be distributed to the employees, ideally all the employees, but if some of the employees are not going to be subject to the testing, that'd be fine. It should be available for applicants as well if there's going to be pre-employment testing. Policy must explain the circumstances. So like I had said before, what are the triggering events? Is it pre-employment, promotion, random, reasonable suspicion, post-accident? The policy should bullet point each of those with an explanation of, what exactly, like reasonable suspicion means, some sort of guidance on that. Then the policy should explain consequences of a positive test. So what happens if I test positive? Am I going to get a free kick at the can here, or am I going to be immediately terminated? Is this going to be a violation of the company's code of conduct that could result in my immediate termination, or are you going to give me a free chance? Are you going to treat alcohol differently than scheduled drugs, than prohibited federal drugs? These are all things that you're going to want to understand and talk about the consequences of a positive test. You'll also want to talk about what is a positive test. So I believe labs don't really pick up alcohol until it's at least 0.02. I might be wrong on that, but a lot of states will say, like, unless it's a 0.02, it doesn't even register, and then and the DOT as well. But then a positive test, some states will say what a positive test is, and for example, Iowa will say that a positive test is a 0.04. So you're not testing, even if you test a 0.03 on alcohol, you're not going to be in violation of the Iowa drug testing law. You won't have triggered an actual positive test until you get 0.04. So kind of like DUI laws or DWI laws. I recommend that you use a certified lab to test. Many labs are, you're going to want to get some sort of collection, and the collector is going to be, either a remote collection, or you're going to send your people to like a hospital or something like that. But there's going to be some sort of collector, third-party collector. You should not be doing the testing yourself. You should not be doing the collection yourself. But the third-party collector will get it. Whether it's a hospital or like one of these mobile drug labs, and then they'll send it off to a lab to actually have it tested. And I recommend using it's like, there are these U.S. certified labs, and I'm sure anybody that you talk to can give you guidance on that. Any of these labs can tell you if they're certified, and then the key here is that, and we want it to be legitimate, right? So then you're going to want to demonstrate that there's a chain of custody, and if you use third-party collectors and you use these certified labs, there should be, they're used to this sort of thing, and they're going to demonstrate a chain of custody. So drug testing, I guess I should have said this, but drug testing, should not be done by you at the company. Drug testing, the testing itself, the collection, the analysis, it should all be done by third parties. And then whether or not, the other themes here are, whether or not you're going to give them, or whether the law requires that you give the person a second chance. And then the minimums that I had talked about before, is it going to be a 0.04? Do you have the flexibility to say 0.02 or above is going to be a positive test? We'll have to find that out, and it's going to depend on the state that you're in. Same with all the other drugs, like THC and other barbiturates, stuff like that. All these scheduled drugs, they're all going to have certain minimums, and that's a lot of that's laid out in the Department of Transportation regulations. So if your state doesn't have anything that specifically says what the minimums are, well, your testing lab might. So they might be able to tell you, like, what are the minimums that's going to get a positive test for them. And so you could just lay that out in your policy. Otherwise, the Department of Transportation regulations on this lay it out as well. But again, the labs will probably tell you, like, what their floor is for triggering a positive test result. And then some states will require that it's going to be a split sample, and so they'll require that you do a retest or a confirmatory retest before doing some sort of disciplinary action against the applicant or the employee. And so a lot of times it's a split sample, and they'll test both samples before the medical review officer contacts the employer or the company about the test results. Okay. Federal laws, Federal Motor Carrier Act. So when I've been talking about the DOT, that's what this is. There is the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988, but it doesn't say anything about drug testing per se. So really, when we talk about federal law, we talk about the Department of Transportation, and we talk about things that CDL, and I know most of you on this call are not don't have CDL drivers, but just to give you an idea of what the Department of Transportation does, because this drives what a lot of the states do, and it's impactful for most of the laws in this area. So the types of testing, this looks familiar, right? Pre-employment testing, post-accident, random, reasonable suspicion. Supervisor has to have at least 2 hours of training for that. So that's something that we need to know for DOT testing. And then there's a return to duty testing. So if you want to come back to duty, you've got to have a positive test, and there's follow-up testing as well, after like rehab of 6 to 12 months. So these are the DOT required types of testing. And again, you have to have a written policy. If you're doing CDL tests, if you've got CDLs and you're doing testing, you have to have a DOT policy. And this is just general. So the DOT is going to test for marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamines, PCP, and then alcohol. So that's what the test is going to do. And again, if you look at the regulations, if you look at the rules that the DOT has, it'll show like what the minimums are of all of these things before it has a positive test. But with the DOT, what we don't want is a lot of drivers, interstate drivers, hyped up on cocaine or opiates or drunk on alcohol or whatever. So that's a good thing. That's why this law is in place. So a positive test will mean the removal from the safety-sensitive job. And then whether you fire or discipline somebody under the DOT is kind of up to you. It's really interesting that so many of these states allow employees a second chance, but the DOT, it's like, we're not going to really, whatever. We'll figure whatever works for you guys. You employer, you can figure it out. And then the DOT does also allow that a refusal to test is a positive as well. So this is just some steps with the DOT and some general knowledge, because it could be a really good basis for you if you don't have a drug testing policy. It could be a really good basis for you to create your policy. Another reason why to test, here are more bullet points, just circling back to this issue, market declines for competitive, and we've talked about most of this stuff, good public image. You want drug-free workers, We do so much work as employers on trying to maintain healthy workers, and with wellness programs and that sort of thing, trying to get various cessation programs going. I mean, we do so much that to lower insurance and medical costs that drug testing could be part of that overall wellness scheme, I guess. Wellness approach, goals, that sort of thing. I mean, it's not like it's healthy for you to smoke marijuana or anything. So why not test? Well, it's easy to avoid a positive. Like I said, stupid test. There's the Wiznators out there of the world and other various, cover-up drugs, I suspect, that people can get on the black market. Maybe, and I don't know, maybe they're even available legitimately in like Colorado and other states that have legalized marijuana, recreational marijuana use. There is a cost. It's disruptive. When somebody tests positive, when there's been an accident in the workplace, you're going to, and you have concerns. So there's been an accident, it hits whatever threshold you have, and you're going to have to take that person, if you don't have a roving drug test third-party contractor lined up, then you're probably going to take them to a collection facility, like a hospital or something like that. Well, it's disruptive. The supervisor is going to be taking them over there, unless you're going to Uber them or get a taxi or something, because you're not going to want to stick somebody who just got into an accident. You're not going to want to stick that employee into a car and let them drive over to be tested. I mean, first of all, they'll, that's a safety hazard, and you don't want to take on that liability. That could be pretty stupid. And then second of all, they just might not show up, which would be indicative, and you could probably terminate them for that. But it's disruptive. Overall, drug testing, it slows down the process of hiring. And then for random testing, and people have to come in, they have to leave the job. I mean, there's downtime from this, and going out to the facility. I mean, it could take hours to go out and do the test and get back to the office or to the work site. You could lose valued employees. Good people do drugs and alcohol, I am sure. So you could lose valuable employees. You could have a hard time recruiting employees. So it could be a competitive disadvantage for you, and there could be a morale hit. So I mean, there are reasons why, and it's expensive. I mean, not terribly expensive, but it's a cost. There's a cost involved with this, and if the positives don't, those questions that we talked about, if the positives don't outweigh the negatives, then definitely, you don't need to be tested. Let's look at a few states really quickly, and I've talked so much about Minnesota already, but again, I bring this up not because I practice here in this state, but because I think the Minnesota law is really good to use as a framework base if you're if you're looking for ideas on how to create a drug testing policy. So in Minnesota, I'm not going to read through these bullet points. Minnesota and Iowa is very similar, and we'll talk about Iowa next. But very similar. You have to have a written policy. You have to define what type of testing you're going to do, and then you have to tell them that they can refuse to test. But you can also tell them that if they refuse to test, the job might be pulled from them, or they'll be fired. And it doesn't make any sense to refuse to test anyway, because if you do test and you test positive as a current employee, then and you test positive, you get a free pass. So on the first positive test, you actually can't be disciplined or fired for that positive test as long as you agree to go into rehab. If you ever test positive again, you can be fired for it, but you get a free kick at it in Minnesota. So it doesn't make any sense to refuse to test here. The other thing in Minnesota is that the employee has the right to ask for a retest. They have to pay for it if they want, but they do have the opportunity to ask for a confirmatory retest and of their sample, and so that is interesting. It's an appellate structure essentially for the employee. Now, if a job applicant tests positive, then the job applicant they don't get a free, like, go to rehab and you still get the job. I mean, you can pull the job from them. But the other weird thing procedurally in Minnesota, or not weird, but just onerous, is that not only do you have to give them a copy of the policy in advance, but then when you're going to test them, you need to give them information on their rights. So what I often recommend is just giving them a copy of the policy again, like when you're testing them. And so a lot of employers get tripped up because they don't share the rights that employees have under the policy. They don't share it with those employees when they're being tested. So they'll give them a policy just like we give handbooks out and then never do anything with it. But here in Minnesota, you actually have to, like, at the time of the testing as well, you need to have them sign off that they've received this. And so if you're here in Minnesota, that I recommend that you do that. If you're in another state that doesn't require that, I don't recommend that you do that because that's a really onerous requirement in my mind. Iowa is similar. We've got a few minutes here, so we'll wrap up. But Iowa is similar in that, except that Iowa says that you have to have at least a 0.04 before it's positive. The difference, the interesting thing about Iowa, and Iowa also has the $1,000 requirement before a post-accident is actually, you can actually test for that. But Iowa also has a thing that says that the employer will pay for rehab up to $2,000. So that's a little too employee-friendly for my taste, and maybe your insurance is paying for it or something anyway. But I'll just move on to it. But I think it's just interesting that Iowa. That's to me the annoying part about the Iowa law. The Iowa law also requires that supervisors who are going to be part of the testing that they receive specific training. So you can't have a supervisor participate in the drug testing, collection and stuff like that without specific training, mandatory training. Okay, let's move on to California. And I mentioned California as a state that doesn't have a drug testing law, which is true, except they do have a drug testing law for state contractors and state agencies. So there are a lot of contractors out there, and so I thought we'd talk about that. There's also some case law on Californians employees having a right to privacy. So California doesn't have really detailed framework for drug testing, but it does talk just generally about drug testing and how there are privacy issues with drug testing, and that. So I mentioned that. So there's no law, so it's kind of free reign in California like it is in other states, but we do have some privacy issues out there in California. So and what are privacy examples? Like restrictions on watching somebody, requiring that somebody stand there while another person collects a sample. I mean, these are important things to know that you can't do. Some states it might not be that big of a deal, but generally, like in California and some of the other states, doing the collection with somebody standing there is not going to be allowed. So 12:59, fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for your attendance today. Exactly an hour. Again, next month we'll have another webinar. It's understanding new paid time off laws. A lot of changes on paid time off laws, so we'll talk about those. And if you have any questions or want to discuss anything from the webinar today, I'd welcome you to reach out to me at any time. And I appreciate your attendance, and I look forward to talking to you next month. Thank you.